Okay, and there we go. And we are live with Erin Murray, and we are going to be talking about carbohydrates this week. We talked about protein a few weeks back, and so today we're going to talk about everybody's nearest, dearest, favorite macronutrient, more than likely, carbs. And I think that it's funny, each of these macros really kind of has their own stigmas and gets attacked in their own ways. We talked about how, protein kind of got jumbled in with all this other stuff, incorrectly. And carbs are definitely another one of those examples of a macronutrient that definitely gets attacked a lot on the internet. There's kind of, I think, this misnomer. It's like, don't never eat carbs. Like how dare you eat carbohydrates and have your blood sugar go up a little bit? Yeah, so we want to bring kind of hopefully a more educated, well-rounded conversation to the topic of carbohydrates. And in particular, talk about maybe some just background knowledge on carbs, kind of some things that we just need to come into the conversation knowing. And then dive into, again, sources of carbs, like what are going to be some really good options for people in the carbohydrate realm. And then transitioning and talking about quantity. Like what are some ways we can go about determining, how many carbs do people need to be eating? Because in my mind, carbs are, when we think quantity, it's kind of like it's the variable that we change the most, right? Like protein tends to be like a pretty, not totally set in stone, but it's like we're looking at about a gram per pound of body weight for people that really train and get after it. Fats, again, are going to be pretty set. I think it's like 0.4 to 0.7 grams per pound is generally where we're going to be for fat. And then we have this carb category, which is totally open-ended. And so maybe the best place to start is just a little background knowledge on kind of like carbohydrates. Like what are carbs? Like what purpose are they serving for us? Why are they potentially important?
Good question. What a big family of macromolecules too. So I think that's kind of one thing that's so interesting. Fat is similar to, it kind of in a way, protein has a little bit less of this, but carbs is this massive family of macromolecules, and they really come in so many different packages. But essentially, what we do is we have these really, really long chains of sugar and different types of sugars, for lack of a better word, essentially there, and we break those down and we absorb them in their single smallest unit. So all these long chains of glucose get snipped as they get digested both chemically and mechanically in the human body, and then we absorb those glucose units. We also absorb fructose. So we break polysaccharides into disaccharides into monosaccharides, and then we absorb the monosaccharide. And the way I think of carbs too is it's most definitely it's the primary fuel source for the body in many regards. Our brain even uses a tremendous amount of glucose per day, so we really know that we use this fuel. This is a fuel for the human body, absolutely, and we store it. So we absorb that glucose, it comes into the bloodstream, and we shuttle that into cells. And we can store that as glycogen in the liver and in muscle. We shuttle that to the brain in excess amounts, as with any macromolecule. We'll store it and save it for later. We've got a packaging system for that, but we use it as fuel. And it's a quick fuel source, as well as it's very effective at being stored for later. And I always joke with people, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. 9th grade biology, they weren't kidding. We take that glucose, we shuttle that into the cell, and importantly, we shuttle that into the mitochondria so we can produce ATP, which keeps you and every cell in your body alive.
Yes, that's a great summary. Thank you. And I think that the speed or the velocity component here is something that's important. I think often misunderstood, right? Because I'm sure someone listening says, "Well, Aaron, like fat can do the same thing. Like fat is also a fuel source that we can tap into and use a lot of." 1,000% correct. When we start talking about carbohydrates, there are going to be a couple of things here. One, it is the brain's preferred fuel source, like hands down, above all, right? Like I think that in Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, Dr. Robert Sapolsky tells the story of how you have, chess masters that can sit down and not be moving. But you look at like the calorie consumption and what they're doing to their blood sugar, it's like similar to someone that's running like a 5K or a 10K just from using their brain, right? So the brain can have a massive demand on glucose. And the other component here is the speed. So if you want to go from a carb, which I think aptly put, if we take that all the way down to its smallest component, which will be a sugar building block, if you want to go from that sugar to get ATP, or you want to go from a fatty acid to get ATP, the sugar to ATP is way faster. There are far less reactions that must take place along the chain to get to ATP. And so that's why it's going to be a preferred fuel source, is because things happen much faster when you get it from a carb or a sugar, as opposed to getting it from a fat.
Right.
And so that's one of those things. You just have to think the number of steps, like how many actual reactions have to take place. It's significantly lower on the carb side than the fatty acid side. And so that's where carbs come to play such an important role, especially if you're doing higher intensity exercise and things along those lines.
Absolutely. The velocity is a perfect word. And it's always interesting to think about when we think about our bodies. I love to think about just what does a cell need? What does it expect? What is it designed to kind of look for if they were sentient? What are they expecting out of us? What are they expecting out of the universe? And the cell has primary, secondary, and tertiary strategies. And that's why we are so truly phenomenal. This is, when we think of our bodies, it's very much an adaptive, I hate the metaphor of an engine, but in many ways this is an adaptive system that's just constantly altering and moving things around and shuttling and siphoning and doing whatever it has to do to continue to produce ATP. So you put more demands on that system, it's going to move things around. You take less demands off that system, it's going to move things around. So if carbs are really quick and there's fewer chemical reactions needed to, and this is also important, we don't produce energy, we transfer energy, because energy is never created or destroyed. So when we think of our cells needing energy literally from the outside world, we take it into the body and transfer it into us so that we can use that energy in a currency that kind of works for our cell. So glucose can do that really quickly in many regards. And if you put demands on a cell, what's it going to do? It's going to use its primary strategy for transferring energy into it so it can continue to contract or function or heal or participate in any of its cellular activities. And carbs come in many forms too, which speaking of velocity, like we often hear about blood sugar spiking really quickly or things of that nature. And all of that has to do with kind of what we're putting into that system and how the system can cope with it. And systems all behave differently, so one body to the other is going to have different responses. But our body's really fabulous, really, truly, miraculously good at dealing with different substrates and doing what it can to cope with them and cope with demands on the cell.
Excellent. I love that. Yeah. That is very, very true. The body, over a very long period of evolution, has become quite good at creating lots of redundancies and ways in and out of pathways. We have a lot of ways to get to ATP, fortunately.
Oh, yeah.
With the carbohydrate story, where, and this is going to be a kind of a broad question, so feel free to potentially narrow this down yourself. Where do you think the attack on carbohydrates and kind of labeling carbs as this very negative thing came from? What's the backstory around that? Because there's obviously been this very big push into super low carb, don't eat carbs, carbs are awful for you, blah 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 blah. What's kind of the backstory, you think, or the big contributor to this movement, this anti-carbohydrate movement?
That's a wonderful question. And I feel like there's a few key components of it. One of them, I believe, is that the way, not to get on my soapbox, but the way nutrition is viewed in our culture is there's just actually a little bit of a misunderstanding, kind of even from the 30,000 foot view. There's actually a misunderstanding because the way nutrition science developed was it really developed to study and understand diseases of deficiency. That's really the origins of nutrition. We looked at literally how to heal scurvy, for example, and all of those diseases of deficiency. So I'm referring to, for those listening, any type of vitamin deficiency in particular, like scurvy or beriberi or pellagra. We discovered vitamins by actually figuring out how to heal those diseases and cure them or reverse them or prevent them. And all of those are single nutrient interactions. If I want to get rid of or prevent scurvy, I give vitamin C. I don't have to do anything else. That's it. And then going into really after the 50s and 60s and post World War II, we started having a society of much more abundance. And we started getting these extraordinarily complex diseases like heart disease. And we took our single nutrient system and said, well, what can I do to prevent heart disease or cure it? What's the one thing? And unfortunately, with these really complex diseases, these are not single nutrient interactions. But we applied that model to it. So then all these labs started fighting about, is it fat? Is it sugar? Is it carbs? And I mean, fast forward 40 years, they're still arguing about it. And these are actually complex diseases that have many, many components to them. So I think our brains crave that one thing because that's such a beautiful, simple answer. Like, wouldn't that be fabulous if there was just this one problem? And we know everyone did that to fat for a long time too. But I think also what's going on here is a gene environment interaction that's very complex because we undoubtedly, human beings have evolved to crave, sense, and seek carbohydrates. We have secondary sugar sensors in the gut even that have nothing to do with taste, but we know we also have many primary taste receptors that respond very positively to carbohydrate ingestion. And now we live in a world where there's rich, fabulously delicious, and very cheap carbohydrate sources all over the place. And we literally have a system that's designed to find those and consume them. But what's happened is we've put those carbohydrate sources into these packages that my favorite way to think of it is there's hard to regulate carbs and fat and foods in general. There's hard to regulate and there's easier to regulate. And when I give a system that's designed to seek carbs and I give that system like McFlurries or those Dunkin' Donuts like Chips Ahoy coffee culotta things, which is just like true mad.
Yep.
It's fascinating, right? It's like insane.
You
That
live in the
body,
heartland of the Dunkin' Donuts.
right? I know New Englander is on every corner. Those are what I call hard to regulate foods. Our system is like, what the actual heck is that, and how can I get more of it? And that's why they have a little bit of an addictive property, but that doesn't mean that all carbs are bad. We just put carbs in a package that's very hard to regulate. So kind of our approach to nutrition has that single nutrient mindset, and then the food that we feed our society is very hard to regulate, and therefore it's easy to find carbohydrate if we reduce it that much as a culprit.
Yeah, there's an enormous difference between having, white rice and potatoes versus the mega whatever sugary coffee drink from Dunkin' Donuts, or like getting the big gulp Slurpee from the gas station, or pounding like a liter of Coke. I think that distinction is so important. And again, this comes back to the packaging concept that we talked about on the protein episode as well. Yeah. You got to consider the package this thing is coming in. Carbs are not inherently bad, but if they're packaged inappropriately, your body is not designed and doesn't know how to like regulate the intake of this thing well. Mm-hmm. Where things that are easier to regulate, your body can ingest and do a pretty good job with, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe this is a good point to transition a little bit to talk about some blood sugar things, because I do think that's an important part of the carbohydrate conversation. Yeah. Is especially now that it's getting easier and easier, fortunately, for people to track and look at what their blood sugar is doing. That's going to give you a really good insight into you as an N of 1 person, mm-hmm. with regards to hard to regulate or easier to regulate carbs and food that you're getting in, right? Mm-hmm. Because is it called levels? I think is what it is. Like it's the little glucometer that you can put on the back of your arm. You used to have to have a note or a prescription essentially from a doctor if you wanted to have a portable glucometer that you could use, which is kind of preposterous, seeing that like blood sugar regulation is like one of the most basic tenets of health and anyone should be able to do it. You don't need to be let's wait for you to be diabetic before I'm going to give this to you, which is exactly mind-blowing to me. But now you have something, I think levels is what it's called. Someone out there correct me if I'm wrong, but like we're finally seeing more of a direct to consumer approach where people can buy these little CGMs, these continuous glucose monitors, slap it on the back of your arm for 3 to 5 days, and take really good notes and see what happens when you eat and consume different types of foods. I think a good example in this realm from back in the day, being down in Costa Rica with Dr. Ben House, like I know for myself personally, I'm a very high carb tolerator. I do really well ingesting very high amounts of carbohydrates. I can eat 500 grams of carbs a day, and my blood sugar will not go over 120, like at all. Meanwhile, my buddy Dan, who was in Costa Rica with me at the time, eats a singular rice cake, and he's at like 200, right? And so there are going to be a lot of individual differences here. And I think just paying attention to the carbs that you're eating and having the blood sugar data to go with it is really going to point you in the direction of like, what sort of things do I handle well versus not handle well? I don't know if you kind of agree with that or if you want to elaborate on that for people, because like we also have to consider the context of when it's being consumed, right? Like, is this pre-workout? Is this post-workout? Am I going to eat a dinner and then go on a nice long, like 15, 20-minute walk? Because all those things are going to impact what the blood sugar does. Let me just kind of like punt that over to you here and see some of your thoughts in this realm.
Yeah, the blood sugar conversation is super interesting, and truthfully, we're really still learning a lot about it, because as you said, there is a lot of variability, but there's definitely some principles that we're pretty comfortable discussing at this point because they seem relatively clear. Although with nutrition, gosh, you never know. But so basically, just for people wondering, because I will take a second to explain this, because a lot of people often are like, okay, Erin, but like, what's blood sugar? Like they feel embarrassed asking, but how would you know? So if for anyone wondering, if you're thinking, what the heck is blood sugar and insulin and why would mine be really high? The way I think of this as, think of kind of little bagels or even sugar cubes going into your bloodstream. That's your glucose. It's the carbohydrate you're absorbing from your meal. It's getting into your bloodstream, and your bloodstream doesn't want things to be out of balance. And we have a fancy word for that called homeostasis. So we really want to maintain homeostasis. So to keep that bloodstream balanced, it's a lot like a highway. We don't want traffic jams on there with a ton of stuff in there. We don't want a ton of fats. We don't want a ton of sugar. We need a balance. So insulin gets pumped out of the pancreas, and it's a hormone that's going to shuttle those little sugar cubes into cells. And insulin has this very interesting action where it docks on a cell, kind of like a lock and key. We often hear the metaphor, and it really is like a key going into a lock that opens up, in a sense, a channel that then allows that sugar cube, that glucose molecule, to enter the cell. And when we do that in an appropriate manner, we're managing how many sugar cubes are in the bloodstream at any given time so that our highways are well functioning. And basically, one of the tenets of disease is the inability to clear that substrate properly. And that's why you hear about things like insulin sensitivity and high blood sugar, which means those sugar cubes are getting into the bloodstream and sitting there. Why do we all have differences in our blood sugar, though? There's a few things. One is the type of carbs we eat and the type of meal we eat will absolutely affect how quickly things get broken down and absorbed. So speed, again, matters there. Right from the get-go in the GI tract, speed is a factor. Things that are wrapped in a fiber matrix, those glucose molecules that are wrapped in fiber, do absorb slower. And fat and protein also slow digestion and slow that kind of entrance into the bloodstream, whereas a red can Coke is pretty much a fire hose of sugar into the bloodstream, for lack of a better term. And we know things like that. But then even there, then we're in the bloodstream. And why are some of us responding differently? Because the speed matters in the GI, but now we're in the bloodstream. Okay, now what's happening there? And the way I think of this is, there is a lot of research that as long as someone was in a caloric deficit over a 24-hour period and for extended periods of time, despite blood sugar spikes, they still will lose weight. So that's a big one there that gets very convoluted, where people say, if my blood sugar spikes, it means I'm storing fat. So it doesn't even matter how many calories I eat. I store fat if my blood sugar spikes. That's a bit of a misunderstanding there. There's some really neat metabolic ward studies on that are cool that we could certainly talk about. But we know that blood sugar spikes are this phenomenon in general that's going to be body specific and food specific. But it also is related to over and under nutrition, but it's also related to how the system is functioning. So someone with a lot of muscle, for example, we know requires more calories, and they burn glucose really efficiently because muscle cells are super sensitive to insulin. They love to take up glucose, and they do more work, and they're really expensive. So blood sugar is going to be variable depending on the composition of the entire meal, and then also the variability. There's some genetic factors. Some people are more predisposed to high blood sugar and kind of some inflammatory markers and adipose tissue deposition. But then also, if we are moving a lot, we use much more. It's a lot. I hate the car and the engine metaphors, but I keep using them today. Forgive me, everyone. But it is a lot like filling up a car with gas and not taking the car anywhere. So there's absolutely kind of a movement and lean mass component that is vastly altering blood sugar responses.
Got it. Yeah. I think that, and there's more going on there. I think you did a really good job of simplifying down to kind of like the big three variables. Is like what package is the carbohydrate coming with? Because, fiber, proteins, and fats are going to change the rate at which the sugar essentially dumps into the bloodstream. Mm-hmm. And then we have to consider potential genetic differences. We have to consider what's the movement environment, either like before or after, right? Because I can eat a large bolus of carbohydrates and go move, and I essentially have a demand base increase in my ability to move sugar from the bloodstream into the cell, mm-hmm. as opposed to eating a large bolus of carbohydrates and then sitting on the couch and watching Netflix, where now I don't have a demand signal to tell the cells to open up into like glucose in, mm-hmm. right? And then we have this other one, which is kind of this body composition conversation, which is, if you tend to carry more muscle mass, you're probably going to be pretty insulin sensitive and do a pretty good job of getting sugar from the bloodstream into these cells. This is one of the things that I've joked about before on social media. Is like everyone I see online who demonizes blood sugar and eating carbohydrates also tend to have no muscle mass, and they don't train and they don't work out.
Yes.
I'm like,
totally.
If you lift and you carry some muscle mass, carbs become way less scary. Mm-hmm. Just like a quick FYI for folks.
Yes.
If you're scared of carbs, maybe we should work out more and build some muscle. But I think with all of that as the backstory is super helpful for people, at least I hope it is. And maybe we transition here and talk more. I'm trying to debate if we should go sources or quantity. I think it probably makes sense to go quantity next. I think it fills in nicely with kind of the conversation we've been having. Mm-hmm. Usually when I'm thinking about how many carbs does someone need, I'm just kind of like subtracting out the difference, to be honest. It's like, here's your protein, here's your fat. I know the total calorie number for the day. So if I subtract out the difference, what's left is carbs. Mm-hmm. And that's like probably the simplest way to come up with the carb number. A more advanced strategy to come up with a carb number would be to wear a CGM, track your blood sugar. And, if you're someone who is really trying to push the performance lever as high as you possibly can, like if you're chasing really high levels of strength and muscle mass and power output and athleticism and all that jazz, you're an example of someone who maybe puts on a CGM, and we're going to see like how high can we take your carbs without your blood sugar kind of, how high can I take your carbohydrates with your blood sugar still being regulated well? Mm-hmm. That's kind of option 2 in my mind. I don't know if those are broadly kind of the two best ways to approach it or how you like to do it. So I will pass it back to you.
Yep, totally agree. That's exactly my general approach as well. I would say the one other thing that I like to throw in there is also taste preference. So if I do have someone who can afford some more fat or some less carb because they love fat, I mean, I'm French, so I love fat. So I need to keep some room in my diet for some more fat because I just like that style of eating. But I have to do that with making sure I'm getting adequate carbs for training. So I will noodle around with those a little bit if I really have someone who has certain taste preferences. And the good news also being you can spare some calories by pulling back on carb and allotting more room for carbs if you love carb. So if you love to have a good dinner roll but I couldn't care less about a roll or a piece of pasta, I might allot some room for fat. But if you really love carbs, you can allot room for carbs. So I do try to tweak things a little bit also for flavor preference because that helps with kind of sustainability of the diet. But otherwise, we need to make sure that carbohydrate needs match movement demands and are appropriate for that person's blood sugar. And I'll also throw in there actually too is GI. A lot of athletes who are aiming to gain weight are eating healthy, fabulous sources of carbohydrates, but they also feel like they have SIBO because they're so bloated from all that fiber. So we also can take a look at how much of those carbohydrate sources should be fibrous, or when you're getting to that place where you're at 300, 400, 500 grams of carbs, we sometimes need to make those a little bit of a simpler carb. But those components I also throw in there as well, just to find a nice number for someone.
Yeah, I think that distinction is really important. So I think two things to pull out there. One is, again, we talked about how protein is kind of the set quantity, and then what we're doing is we're kind of playing this balancing act. If you think of them each like a dimmer switch, we're kind of like or like volume, right? We're essentially turning up the volume on fats, and if I turn up the volume on fats, I have to turn down the volume on carbs. If I turn up the volume on carbs, I've got to turn down the volume on fat, right? Like those two kind of like move in opposite directions. And so yeah, like if you are a person who wants to eat more fat, and we dial that up for you a bit more, then carbs will come down. But personally, the way I like to try to do it, and this depends on the individual in question, right? Because we got to figure out what actually makes sense and works for you and your goals and your lifestyle. But for me, it's a demand-based decision. On training days, my carb get pushed higher, my fat gets pulled lower. On off days or rest days, or if I'm doing like a really low intensity day where I know my carb demand is not going to be very high, my carbs get pulled down and my fat gets pushed up. And so I like to fluctuate. Like in the past, like that's what I had my athletes do. We've had a lot of success kind of following that strategy as long as the implementation is okay. But for other people at the same time, sometimes they're just better off if it's just kind of like set, like we're just going to do this every single day, because trying to change it that frequently just becomes kind of a pain in the butt for them. And then, man, what was the second thing? Now I lost my train of thought. The second thing there that I wanted to pull out, I totally forget. And so
we can
if it
circle
comes
back
to me.
I totally
If it
agree
comes
with the
back to me,
cycling thing, I will say. Carb cycling is kind of what James was just explaining. And that's just a fancy term for it, but it works very well. I do find that can be a really nice way to let your nutrition have a little bit of a rhythm to it, unless someone likes to do the same thing every day. But totally agree. You can bump up. It's very kind of, it seems oddly simple. Bump up carbs when you're moving more and pull fat back. And then when you're moving less, let fat come up and pull carbs back a little bit. There's kind of very technical ways to do that, but it's beautifully simple.
it really is quite simple, and like you don't need to understand much about physiology to appreciate that. I think like nutrition, a lot of times we're just trying to match supply and demand appropriately. Like if I have a big lift or I'm doing high intensity things, I'm going to demand carbs. My carbs need to be higher. If I have an off day or if I'm doing like a really low intensity aerobic work, my demand for fat's going to be higher. So I think like that carb cycling thing, and yeah, carb cycling is kind of this like really fancy way of thinking about it. And like, well, like I've been carb cycling. I didn't know I was. I've been carb cycling, air quotes, for like a decade now.
Right.
Before it was apparently cool, or someone put a label on it. But I did remember finally the point I was going to make, which is depending on the camp you're in. Like if you're in the weight loss camp, a different conversation, right? Because we're trying to pull things down for you. But if you're in the camp where we're trying to push carbs up or push up calories, like, and this is what I hear all the time, like when either we're onboarding new clients or I'm chatting with people and I'm asking them how's their nutrition and they're trying to gain weight. We use the gain weight as an example because it's more relevant here. So I was like, oh man, my nutrition's great. It's so on point. I eat so clean. I'm like, okay. That's usually like when I hear that, I'm like massive red flag. Huge, like I just got like alarm bells going off all in my brain. And I'm like, great, you're going to be the person who eats super clean and you're 1,000 calories short of where you need to be. And you're probably going to be 200 grams off on your carbs. Because at a certain point, as we push up these calories and we chase performance, it's like, I'll be honest, there's no chance I'm eating 500 grams of carbs from like really clean carb sources. Yeah. Like I'm only going to eat so much rice and like banana and fruit, and then like vegetables you get in, but like they don't really pack, like broccoli doesn't really carry a whole lot of carbs to it. They're important, but not for that reason. It's like at a certain point in time, I got to start bringing in some stuff that's a little bit denser, right? Like some juices maybe, or some jellies and jams. Like you're going to have to at some point kind of get off of this like super clean idea and figure out like where can I get some cheaper, easier, denser carbohydrate sources, like some cereal maybe, or whatever it is. But yeah, I think that for the weight gain crowd, that's going to be really important. And that was the thing that I wanted to kind of tie back on there, which is, yeah, like I love that you want to eat clean, and we're all for eating clean, and it's really important. Mm-hmm. But we got to make sure that we're actually hitting the numbers we need to hit. Weight loss, folks, this will be not really an issue for you because we're pulling things down most of the time on weight loss. And so, like, we're not playing this game of figuring out how to get in more and more calories.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. And that's that fiber component when a lot of these foods are whole food ingredients. They're so wonderful, but there's a little bit, honestly, it's because they're easy to regulate. When they're hard to regulate because they're very simplified, they're not filling. So it's a reverse concern. When they're easy to regulate, like, man, we feel that fullness. We hit those thresholds. Our stomach, literally, we have mechanoreceptors in the stomach that speak to our brain and let us know, I'm really full down here. I can't take more. We have slow digestion. They're very fibrous. All these fabulous things, and they're so easy to regulate unless you have performance goals. You actually need some refined carbohydrates that are going to sneak more calories and carbs into you without you getting physically uncomfortable. And that's where I do like to use like juices and tropical fruits and acai bowls, and not even like pureed vegetables and fruits, but sometimes juiced fruits, like no fiber even in the juice. When athletes are getting really full and having a hard time keeping weight on or gaining weight, it does have to get more refined.
Yeah, I like orange juice, like organic orange juice and organic cranberry juice are usually the two that I'll turn to if I need more. Mm-hmm. It's easy. Like I sip on them with a meal, so it's coming in with fiber and other things, or it's something that I have around my workout when I know that my demand for that is going to be quite high. But the last bit here I wanted to get to on carbs before we wrap this up is going to be sources. And this is a big one. Like there are a lot of carbs. You know, I think that we can potentially break these down into more of these denser type carbohydrates because, you know, our vegetables are also going to fall under the carbohydrate umbrella, but they're not really bringing a lot of carbs to the table. It's like the vegetables are bringing more of like the fiber and kind of like the micronutrient composition and all that jazz. But if we wanted to just kind of like give a broad stroke on some recommended good sources of carbohydrates, what would be kind of the first things that come to mind?
Yeah, I would think of them definitely in a spectrum of kind of wrapped up versus free. And all of our vegetables and everything, as you said, fruits and vegetables have carbohydrates wrapped in those fiber matrices. Fruits might have a little bit more. Vegetables can get pretty low. I mean, if you've ever tried to eat a bag of spinach, you know, there's like 5 grams of carbs in the whole bag. So they're wonderful, but really not a primary carb source. So I actually like to have people think of vegetables and then carbohydrates differently, even though vegetables are technically a carb. So I might say a serving of vegetables and 65 grams of carb at this meal. So I actually kind of separate those even sometimes just for ease of use. And then with carb sources, you can absolutely look at root vegetables and fruits and rices and rice products. There's so many great rice noodles and rice pastas now, like Jovial Foods pastas. If anyone's ever tried those, they're so good.
They're fantastic.
Aren't they so yummy? And they're so
good.
Effective at not being too filling, I find. So I recommend a lot of great things like that. Any rice product I tend to really love. And then, as I said, all the root vegetables and tropical fruits and oats and buckwheat and quinoa, even though it also is high in protein. Some of those options are really nice. Even playing around with some grains, amaranth and farro and things like that can be really nice as well. And a lot of fruits and veg, certainly. And then if we need more refined carbohydrates, we can definitely go into rice cakes, juices with no fiber in them, cereals, corn and cornflake products and things like that can all be good as well.
Nice. And then would you throw kind of like potatoes, sweet potatoes, and that whole gambit in there as well?
Yep, all those root vegetables and also squashes. Love squashes. But again, really fibrous. So pull out some butternut in the fall, but like you might also need rice in that meal if you're a high carb eater. But all those root vegetables are wonderful. And potatoes are also really easy to grow. My potatoes in my garden are looking really good right now, and they're so yummy when you grow them at home. So highly recommend. But sweet potatoes and white potatoes are wonderful. And then all the squashes as well.
I love it. My wife will like to hear that. I'll have to let her know that potatoes are a little bit on the easier side to grow.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. Well, Erin, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I hope this has been beneficial for folks. You know, obviously in a 35, 40-minute podcast, we can't, you know, kind of go into the textbook of carbohydrates or protein or fats, you know, because these things are massive. I always think back to grad school, and this is unrelated to nutrition specifically, but I remember being in grad school and then seeing these people on the internet talk about nitric oxide and NO, and they talk about it in like a pretty very, very simplified thing. It's like, oh yeah, everybody just needs to like tape your noses open because if you nasal breathe, you're going to get more nitric oxide. I'm like, holy crap, that is ridiculous. Like, you're like, we are way oversimplifying this. I'm like, because on my desk next to me, there was a textbook, and I like, kid you not, it was probably about like 5 inches thick, thousands of pages. That textbook was only on nitric oxide. That was all that textbook was on.
Yeah.
Thousands of pages on just nitric oxide. And then people on the internet are like, just tape your noses open, you get more NO, and like it's going to solve all your like your veins and everything. Like your arteries are going to dilate better. They're going to deliver more blood flow. I'm like, that is asinine, and that is not correct. And so it's like, I want to do as good a job as we can on these in short periods of time, trying to have a well-rounded conversation and give people an honest look at the kind of pros and cons of these macros and try to provide a better conversation, maybe than what they're finding on the internet of people getting into their little tribal camps and attacking. So hopefully people are finding these useful and beneficial. And Erin, thank you so much again for coming on. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me. I totally agree. We can always get into more funky stuff. There's always super interesting research to look at as well, and especially as it relates to training and feeding and regulation and things like that. But hopefully these things feel actionable, because there are some things that we know we can kind of run with a little bit if you don't want to know all the weeds. Hopefully this feels actionable to people. But I always do get worried. I know you helped me with that, though. It's you don't want to oversimplify to an error, but you also have to give some people some actionable tools. So trying to do that.
Yes. Good. Well, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. Always appreciative of you listening. Have a fantastic rest of your week, and we'll be back next week. Talk soon.